Hello class, and in this chapter we're going to talk about monetary policy, GDP, and price level. So we're going to go through monetary policy, how the Fed can implement it, their dual mandate, its impact on GDP, evaluation and issues, big picture, and what's known as the Taylor rule. So the Federal Reserve can do three things: open market operations, which we talked about in chapter 14, or buying and selling government bonds. They can change interest rates and also set forward guidance. So open market operations, once again, influence the money supply. Buying bonds to decrease an interest rate, and by buying bonds they flow money into the economy. Selling bonds to increase an interest rate, they pull money out of the economy. And that's what's shown here on this graphic. And this is when the Fed sells bonds. So once again, if the Fed buys bonds, money supply is going to increase because the Fed is going to create new money to pay for them. Effect on bond price, it increases bond demand, driving up the price, and bond interest rate is going to decrease as the equilibrium bond price increases. If they sell bonds, the opposite happens. Money supply is going to drop. The bond supply goes up, driving the price of bonds down. And as the price of bonds go down, the interest rate's going to go up on the bonds. Administered rates. So the Fed sets interest rates not for you and I, but for banks. And when the Fed does set those rates, they do determine what banks charge you and I. So things like the interest rate on reserve balances. The Fed, once again, will pay banks interest on reserves they store with them. And the overnight reserve repo rate, that's the overnight rate that the Fed will lend short-term money to banks at. They influence the money market as well, the discount rate. So the Fed has full credibility to enforce administered interest rates, and they constantly give news briefings about their guidance on interest rates. What are they going to do with them? Recently, Jerome Powell just spoke about being open to cutting rates. And the discount rate, once again, that's the one that banks can borrow money from the Fed. It's useful during major financial crises. If a bank needs a lot of money to prop themselves up, they can borrow it from the Fed, and the Fed can create any amount of money that's needed. You or I cannot borrow at the discount rate, but it is a major component of the interest rates that you and I pay. Banks then add more onto it. So the discount rate, once again, banks and thrifts are eligible. It's the interest rate paid to the Fed for currency reserves borrowed against collateral, and it's for emergency money for banks. In 2020, 2.25%. In 2022, it dropped to almost zero as the recovery from COVID happened. It's back up several percentage points now. Interest rate on balances of reserves. If a bank chooses to hold their reserves at the Fed will pay interest. And the overnight rate, so things like money market funds, non-depository financial funds, this is the interest rate paid by the Fed on collateralized loans, and it basically controls money market interest rates. You could put your money in money market accounts, funds, and the like as well. So those are the three rates the Fed has power over. Forward guidance. So anytime the Federal Reserve holds press conferences or talks to the public, this is an example of forward guidance. They communicate to the public how they see the state of the economy and how they're going to do monetary policy going forward. Once again, about a week ago, Jerome Powell gave a press conference, and he stated that he's going to be open to cutting rates in September. Doesn't necessarily mean he's going to, but that's certainly a more pro-rate cut stance than he's had recently. That's an example of forward guidance. And when the Fed does make remarks, you'll see stock markets change very quickly. They could go up or down because individuals and businesses are going to use this information to shape their decisions. And it can also affect the money supply as well. Just simply the Fed stating where they see the economy going or what's going on can have major implications on the economy. The federal funds rate, that is the Federal Reserve's policy rate, and it helps communicate monetary policy. It's determined in the federal funds market, and they set a target range. And the effective rate's the equilibrium rate in the federal funds market. So prior to the Great Recession in 07-08, the Fed used a smaller number of monetary policy tools. Known as open market operations, we've talked about that, buying and selling bonds. However, the Fed appeared to be out of options because the effective funds rate fell towards zero. Once interest rates drop to zero, you can't cut them anymore. In economics, if we cut rates, we can in theory spur demand. We make money cheaper, people are more apt to borrow it and use it. But if rates go to zero, if it's free to borrow money, or effectively so, you have what's known as the zero lower bound problem. How are you going to entice people to borrow money if it's already zero or effectively zero to do so? So the Fed did things like quantitative easing and tightening, trying to lower longer-term interest rates through open market bond purchases or selling bonds to raise interest rates. And this unconventional monetary policy appeared effective, but the Fed learned to start influencing long-term rates instead of just the short-term ones. But there was a big problem from this, and it's a problem we're still facing today. Through this quantitative easing, the Fed greatly expanded the money supply. And consequently, Congress is encouraged to run larger budget deficits. We've spoken about the national debt in this class. It's just been snowballing worse and worse and worse, especially since COVID. And the big one here, danger of inflation, we saw this during the recovery from COVID. The Fed put so much more money into the money supply with really low interest rates that inflation spiked to levels we hadn't seen since the early 1980s. Many years ago, in the 70s, Congress ordered the Fed to pursue two objectives. And those two objectives are the following: a full employment rate of unemployment, meaning that the overall rate of unemployment is meeting a target where we are saying that the workforce is fully employed. No matter what in an economy, you will always once again have people who are unemployed between jobs, coming out of school. But they set targets for a proper rate of employment, in addition to a target rate of inflation, where they do not want inflation to exceed a certain amount. The target rate of unemployment is what the Fed currently estimates the full employment rate in the economy, or what the economy should be doing. And they will try to expand the money supply if unemployment rate is going up. It makes it more attractive to hire people and businesses to borrow money and grow. And they'll try to restrict the money supply if the unemployment rate falls. Too low of an unemployment rate is not necessarily a good thing in an economy, because it could be a sign of inflation. And neutral monetary policy, the Fed tries to maintain an unemployment rate at any one time in the economy of around 3.5%. Since 2012, the Fed has set a targeted inflation rate of 2% per year. And with that small rate of inflation, it avoids that zero lower bound problem. You can make arguments that any inflation is not necessarily great, because even 2% per year over a few decades, money is going to lose a lot of purchasing power. But they state that when inflation starts going over that, it's going to start hurting people saving money. If inflation's tremendous, you don't really want to necessarily save money in traditional ways. And consequently, that's what they determine an appropriate rate of inflation, compensating for upward measurement bias in addition to helping with downward wage flexibility. So the Fed sets what's called the bullseye chart for the dual mandate, and in January of 2022, look how far removed we were from it. Inflation was running at about 7%. Unemployment rate was pretty close, slightly above that 3.5, but we had tremendous inflation as we came out of COVID, mostly due to, once again, low interest rates and a lot of money circulating through the economy. Inflation has since come down, but it is still higher than that 2% number. So monetary policy can have massive effects on GDP and prices. So depending on whether or not it's expansionary or restrictive can really influence the overall state of the economy. Because monetary policy influences the market for money, Whether or not money is cheap or expensive is going to influence investment, as well as equilibrium GDP. So if we look at these curves right here, real domestic product and real GDP in the price level, so as equilibrium is changing and price levels changing, so real domestic product on the right and real GDP and the price level on the right as well. So supply of money and at different demands, so as the supply is staying the same at different demands of money, as money is becoming more into demand, prices are going up, less demand, prices are going down. So what happens if you have too expansionary of a monetary policy? So if you print too much money, if you're expanding the money supply too much, what can happen? Well, first off, what can happen is inflation. But why might the economy need an expansionary monetary policy? So let's say the economy is in a recession. People are getting fired. Businesses aren't investing. The economy is turning down. What can the Fed do? And that's going to be, once again, expansionary monetary policy. So the Fed can lower targets for the federal funds rate. They can cut interest rates. They're going to purchase bonds. When they purchase bonds, once again, money flows into the economy. And this is going to expand the money supply. If we expand the money supply, what happens when there's a greater supply? Prices are going to come down. So interest rates, therefore, are going to come down. So the Fed tries to use expansionary monetary policy when they are facing a recession, when the economy is doing very poorly, such as what happened after COVID. Restrictive monetary policy is what we saw starting in 2022 more so. When inflation's going up, the Fed has to raise rates and curtail the money supply to try to reduce that inflation. By tightening money, it becomes less attractive to borrow. It'll slow or cool down economic growth. It'll raise interest rates and therefore hopefully get that inflation under control. So if we have unemployment and a recession, the Fed is going to use expansionary monetary policy. So in this part here, here's all of the tools available to them. Money supply is going to go up. Interest rates are going to drop. Spending increases, demand increases, and we should have a rise in GDP. Restrictive monetary policy should do the opposite. If we have inflation, we're going to shrink the money supply, cause interest rates to increase, drop spending and demand, and eventually break that inflation. So why is monetary policy used so much instead of, once again, fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is the government controlling their spending, either increasing or decreasing it. Monetary policy is usually much faster. What does the government have to do to enable fiscal policy? Generally pass laws, and you've seen how slow Congress can be in doing that. So consequently, monetary policy is fast and flexible. They don't have to wait for Congress to debate bills and pass things to raise taxes or lower them or change spending. And Congress faces tremendous political pressure anytime they do that. The Fed really doesn't, because they're not running for election. Monetary policy is also more subtle than fiscal policy. It can be altered quickly, it could be rescinded much more quickly, whereas if we pass all kinds of tax legislation, we're probably not going to be able to rapidly undo it. In 2007-08, the large recession, we faced a crisis of mortgage defaults. A lot of home mortgages were going into foreclosure and defaulting. So the Fed took quick and innovative action using monetary policy. They kept interest rates low under a zero-rate policy, and also purchased all sorts of debt securities, so bonds and debt securities, at pre-crisis prices, the ones that had been hammered because everybody was afraid they were worthless or going to be defaulted on. So firms wouldn't have to panic and sell them at current low prices. So the Fed kept a lot of banks from failing using monetary policy. By 2009, we were in a slow recovery, but we still had that zero-bound problem. We couldn't cut short-term rates anymore, so the Fed started influencing the long-term rates, as we just looked at, with quantitative easing and tightening. They couldn't really do anything else with short-term rates, so they wanted to bring long-term rates down. What happened in COVID? All of the lockdowns during COVID, the business shutdowns, caused a massive economic threat. And the Fed addressed this issue with forward guidance, speaking to the public. They lowered rates and once again reinstituted quantitative easing. It was an extremely short recession, but how much of this was due to the Fed is debatable. Did that recession break just when the economy started running again, when the lockdowns eased up? And also, all that quantitative easing, undoubtedly led to a lot of inflation. So monetary policy faces both limitations and complications. There's recognition and operational lags like anything else. First off, we have to recognize there is a problem and then put that monetary policy into effect and wait for it to do something. So there's always going to be a lag. The Fed's not omnipotent. Monetary policy is often needed to be augmented with fiscal policy. In recent recessions, the Fed can't do everything. We also can face things such as cyclical asymmetry and a liquidity trap. A lot of economists have argued that monetary policy is better in slowing expansion and controlling inflation than it is with recovering from a recession. And even though the Fed may create excess reserves, it doesn't necessarily mean the banks will actually use the money. So that's what we mean here by things like a liquidity trap. In recent recessions, the U.S. has used fiscal policy more with government spending, but it's also not possible to know exactly what policy has succeeded and what one has failed or what one had more power. So just because banks get really liquid, it doesn't mean they're going to use that money. Keep that in mind. In 07-08, due to the recession, the labor force began shrinking, and also it accelerated during the COVID recession. Labor shortages drove up labor costs and pushed the supply curve to the left. Anytime we have a shortage of something, the supply curve is going to pull in. And the COVID recession also screwed up the global supply chain, raising costs. Energy costs went up, and all of that steamrolled into more inflation. So input prices, productivity, and the legal institutional environment lead to supply. Consumption, investment, net export spending, and government spending lead to demand, and that's going to determine how much output, employment, income, and prices are present in our economy. So what's the Taylor rule, these last few slides? It's a policy rule proposed by the economist John Taylor, and it suggests how the Fed will adjust the nominal interest rate as it pursues that dual mandate. And it's based on the idea that if forced to make a choice between inflation being too high and unemployment being too high, central bankers would probably err on the side of inflation. And the Taylor rule assumes that the Fed cares twice as much about full employment than it does about inflation. And recently that has certainly seemed to be the case. Inflation is stubbornly high, but employment is good. And the Fed seems to care more about just making sure there aren't large amounts of an unemployed workforce than worrying as much about inflation. However, inflation is certainly an issue. It massively affects purchasing power. It can hurt savers, people on fixed incomes, and the like. So it's just food for thought here. So the inflation gap, the current actual rate of inflation minus the 2% target, and the unemployment gap, the current unemployment minus the Fed's 3.5% target. and the real risk-free interest rate of around 2%. So according to the Taylor rule, the Fed target interest rate is equal to the risk-free interest rate plus the current actual inflation rate plus 0.5 times the inflation gap minus 1.0 times the unemployment gap. And note the multiplier in front of unemployment is twice as large as inflation. And it's keeping with Professor Taylor's assumption that the Fed cares twice as much about unemployment than inflation. Now, this rule has been come up with by an economist. It's not necessarily the policy of the Fed, but he's used this to try to explain how the Fed has been operating. And it shows why they used quantitative easing. Inflation was negative at that point, but unemployment was 10%. So assuming an inflation rate of 2% and a natural rate of unemployment of 3.5, the effective federal funds rate suggested by the Taylor rule is negative 6.04%. In terms of negative inflation, that's known as deflation. That means money is gaining value that you hold. So people would have consequently been converting all their money into cash, causing multiple economic problems as well. So instead of the short-term fix, they went to try to influence the long-term rates with quantitative easing. That's just some food for thought here. That's going to take us to the end of chapter 15.